Willkommen in einem anderen video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 16 of my organisational series. In this case I'll be providing an overview of the French corps system used during the Napoleonic War. One of the most significant developments in command and control during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars was the introduction of the combat division and the army corps. The increased size of armies during the 18th century, as well as multiple theatres of war, required administrative reorganisation of European armies. Generally, the standard military unit was the infantry regiment, composed of 1 or 2 combat battalions and a depot battalion. Cavalry regiments also remained the standard, although their squadrons could be divided among armies in different theatres. The army commander, therefore, contended with controlling numerous battalions and squadrons on the strategic, operational and tactical level. This created an enormous burden for army staffs, who had the responsibility for keeping track of the units within an army, keeping them supplied and ensuring that orders were properly disseminated in a timely fashion. This was no easy task. The coordination of tens of thousands of men on campaign often led to confusion and inefficiency. To reduce this difficulty, European armies were often organised into ad hoc wings, columns, Abteilung, divisions and brigades, whose composition depended entirely on the mission at hand. There was no standardisation of army organisation above the regiment. In 1759, during the Seven-Year War, the Duc de Broglie, 1718 to 1804, established command divisions within the French army, but these were temporary formations. Also, during the mid-18th century, the French army introduced the administrative military division. France was divided into military regions, and each general of a division was responsible for the regiments garrisoned within his region. This organisation, however, did not translate into standing combat divisions that emerged during the French Revolutionary War, 1792 to 1802, but it provided the foundations for that development. Pierre de Bosset, 1700 to 1780, a staff officer, advocated the introduction of the division as the standard formation in the 1760s to 1770s. Divisions would enable an army to advance along parallel routes and unite rapidly for battle. The formation would facilitate greater efficiencies on campaign and provide for the rapid movement of large numbers of troops over great distances, as opposed to an army using a single road, moving slowly and encumbered by supply trains. The division began to develop in the mid-18th century as a means of improving an army's strategic mobility and its ease of command. A general commanding an army did not have to keep track of each battalion and squadron, but merely of his divisions. Meanwhile, the divisional generals were responsible for controlling their respective regiments. Indeed, while the French explored a divisional organisation, they also introduced the infantry brigade, a unit formed of 2 infantry regiments. Prussia, too, organised its armies into brigades, but did not adopt the combat division. What made the French division unique was the integration of artillery and cavalry into the table of organisation. Typically, artillery and cavalry were under the direct control of the army commander, who appropriated it to its subordinates as needed. By integrating artillery and cavalry into the divisional structure, the French possessed greater firepower and reconnaissance at a lower level. Divisions could march divided, engage the enemy, and have adequate support for a short period until reinforced by other divisions. The principle is often cited as march divided, fight united. During the French Revolutionary Wars, the increased size of campaign armies compelled the revolutionaries to introduce the combat division as a permanent entity within army organisation. Each division comprised 2 infantry brigades, a cavalry detachment, a squadron or regiment, and an artillery battery. At times, generals gave command of multiple divisions to a single subordinate, depending upon the plan of operations. General André Massena, 1758 to 1817, for example, led 2 divisions of Napoleon Army of Italy in 1796. General Kleber also led 2 divisions in Belgium in 1794. Napoleon built upon the divisional foundations to expand the organisational system, introducing the corps d'armée. These bodies existed during the Revolution, but in a temporary state. Each corps comprised 2 or 3 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, later division, divisional artillery and a corps artillery reserve. Engineer companies and a corps staff were introduced or included to make the organisation a self-contained fighting unit of 20,000 to 30,000 men. A Marshal of France, and occasionally a General of Division, a General de Division, commanded a French corps after 1804. Each divisional commander, his brigades, and the regiment comprised the corps, and that remained part of the corps from campaign to campaign. A French corps also, like a Roman legion, generally remained in a specific European theatre. Thus, Marshal Louis de Vaud's vaulted Third Corps of the Grand Army retained its composition from its establishment in 1803 through to 1812 and was based in Germany. Prussia and Austria adopted the divisional system by the early 19th century, but their divisions remained largely administrative, and no standing combat divisions came into being until 1809 and thereafter. The Russians did develop military divisions and combat divisions by 1805, but they were incredibly cumbersome and lacked the appropriate staff to manage the brigades and regiments adequately. In Britain, brigades and divisional organisations were ad hoc, with formations established for specific expeditions. The corps was, in effect, an extension of the divisional system and allowed armies to become larger while retaining their mobility and flexibility. Each division, and later a corps, was a self-contained, all-arms formation which could fight independently for a period until reinforcements could arrive to support it. You can really see this in 1805. While the Austrians were organising their army into columns and then a pseudo-type of corps, their independent columns or corps lacked the flexibility to effectively fight independently against the larger French corps. This was one reason why the Austrians concentrated their formations at Ulm, with disastrous consequences. Most of the material that I've described so far comes from an entry in the internet, and I'll provide that link at the end of the video and also in the description. So, we've now covered the theoretical aspect of the corps development. Let's now get into the empirical nitty-gritty details of the corps of the French army between 1800 and 1815. This analysis begins in 1800 and ends in 1815 and looks at the corps system from the point of view of its structure during the war and during the campaigns during this period. There are many good books and videos which address this corps topic, or the topic of corps development, in far more detail, specifically from a theoretical point of view. But from this point on, I'm only looking at the actual structure of the corps that fought in the various campaigns to see how they developed, how they evolved, and how they were structured. If we go to 1800 and look at Napoleon's army at Marengo, the two main corps of his army consisted of around about 10,000 men each. Each corps consisted of two divisions along with a small number of cavalry, probably 4 weak squadrons each. There were also a number of smaller corps formations in the army as well, shown here. As France had been at war for several years prior to this, each corps had an experienced staff, although its possible formations were removed or added as the need arose, so it lacked a level of consistency. So we could probably assume by 1800 the corps were fairly consistent and organisations with the corps staff having knowledge and understanding of the subordinate formations and everyone really knowing each other, although, as I indicated, a lot of changes did occur during the campaigns. While in 1800 the corps structure was comparatively standard, it was standard or standardised or formal because France had been at war for many years. That was not its normal state. By 1805, that was its normal state. In addition to this, the corps structures had changed quite dramatically. This shows the one French corps, the smallest being the first, which was of a similar size to the largest corps at Marengo. However, several corps were as large as armies. The fourth corps consisted of almost 28,000 men, which made it almost as large as Napoleon's entire army at Marengo. The corps had dramatically increased in its size. In all the corps shown now, the number of divisions within each corps had risen to 3, which does partially explain the increase in strength. It should be noted in 1805 the French corps were at full strength, while at Marengo they were generally under strength because they had been fighting for quite a period of time. This could also explain the difference in manpower. But I suspect that the main reason was a force which was well over 10,000 men had a much better chance of operating independently. The other organisational change that's noted was the increase in cavalry strength, with the corps containing a light cavalry division or brigade, which consisted of a number of smaller formations. The larger corps contained almost 2,000 cavalry, which was significantly greater than anything at Marengo. A quick point about the cavalry types. In most cases, cavalry attached to the corps were light cavalry, or what was called light cavalry. There are some examples of dragoons, which are typically classed as medium or heavy cavalry, being attached to a corps, but with the French this was not very common. The corps which were most likely be on the flank did have additional light cavalry formations attached. This is more obvious in 1809, but was even the case in 1805 in some cases. In 1805, the heavy cavalry, which consisted of carbineers, cuirassiers and dragoons, were all assigned to a single cavalry formation. I'm uncertain if this was called a corps at the start of the 1805 campaign, but at a later date, the heavy cavalry was formally organised into cavalry corps. In 1805, due to a lack of horses, some dragoons were on foot, as you can see here. As the 1805 campaign progressed, this nice and neat structure began to fragment. So by the Battle of Austerlitz, many corps were down to 2 divisions each, and special formations were formed, such as the Grenadier Division, shown at the top right corner. The interesting point was the corps structure was in place and the corps staff fully manned at the beginning of the war. So when France entered the war in 1805, the corps staff were corps staff, that's their position from the beginning, and they were familiar with the subordinate units. This could have been due to it being prepared for a possible invasion of England, but I suspect the true French innovation concerned the corps was its permanent nature. When the Austrians developed their own corps system in 1809, the actual corps staff were all ad hoc. By 1812, the corps had a permanent staff, but this took a long time for the Austrians to implement. In 1806, we can see an example of a corps with more than one light cavalry division or brigade, in this case the 4th Corps. We can also see this corps had grown in size to almost 30,000 men. The 3rd Corps was of a similar strength, although the other corps were all smaller. The cavalry reserve formation had grown to a truly enormous size. The one innovation which did occur in 1806 was the addition of a light cavalry division or brigade to the cavalry reserve. Once again, I'm uncertain if this was an official corps yet. Many of the corps in 1806 contained the same infantry divisions that they had in 1805, indicating a permanence of structure. In 1807, the cavalry reserve was finally split up into cavalry corps, this being the 1st Cavalry Corps. It's possible this occurred because Napoleon had to spread his army around as he fought the Prussians and Russians, or it could have been to make the commanding of the heavy cavalry much easier. Whatever the reason, this structure was to remain until 1815. We now move to 1809. This shows the 3rd Corps at Wagram. This contained both an extra light and heavy cavalry brigades or divisions. The corps had also grown to 4 divisions. The size had grown to almost 37,000 men, a truly huge corps structure. On the French left flank at Wagram, the 4th Corps was also very large, also containing a 4th Infantry Division and with an extra light cavalry brigade or division, but in this case there was no heavy cavalry. The other corps were all smaller, with some being very small indeed, and contained generally 2 to 3 divisions each and 1 cavalry division or brigade each. When we move to 1812, this expansion in corps size continued. In this case, the 1st Corps consisted of 5 infantry divisions, although we can see the cavalry are down to a single formation, which I'm pretty certain was a division brigade size. The source I used called this a cavalry corps, which I'm certain must have been an error. In 1812, the cavalry corps were also increasing in size, with the 1st Cavalry Corps consisting of 3 heavy divisions and 1 light division, and composed of more than 7,000 cavalry. In 1813, this trend of increased size was reversed. The first major downturn occurred in 1813, which was expected. Napoleon had to rebuild his army after disaster in Russia, and you can see this in the structure of his new army. The second corps, which was one of his major corps, was now down to only 15,000 men, and in this case did not contain any cavalry. The third corps did contain a light cavalry division, but its strength was less than 20,000 men. On the other hand, the cavalry corps did retain their former strength, although they were slightly weaker, with the first cavalry corps consisting of about 6,500 cavalry. The big change here was that there was a dramatic increase in light cavalry. The decline of the French corps strength continued, and in 1814 the French army at St. Corps were but a shadow of their former strength. The second corps consisted of less than 15,000 men, and the fourth cavalry corps was well under 4,000 cavalry. What made this worse was the army Napoleon commanded consisted of only a few of these corps rather than the 6+ that he commanded in 1812 or even in 1865. When Napoleon returned in 1815, the corps size went up, although not to the sizes that we saw in 1812. The first corps consisted of 4 infantry divisions, 1 cavalry division or brigade, and consisted of over 18,000 men. The second corps was even larger, consisting of almost 24,000 men, as well as consisting of 4 infantry divisions and 1 cavalry division or brigade. The cavalry corps were, in contrast, much smaller. The first cavalry corps, consisting of only light cavalry, had a strength of 2,300 cavalry. The third cavalry corps, consisting of heavy cavalry and light cavalry, and while it was larger at 3,300 cav, was still rather small compared with 1812 to 1814. The French corps system allowed Napoleon to command armies of up to 100,000 men with ease. However, the limit seemed to be the number of corps, or at least that was the limit that Napoleon had. I suspect the ideal number of corps, or at least infantry corps, were 6. I also noticed that Napoleon tended to have 2 main corps which were rather large, and these typically, if possible, occupied the flank positions. The remaining infantry corps were normally smaller and tended to reside in the centre of the line if possible. This may have made command even easier than I would have originally suspected, because the 2 main flank corps were probably the corps that Napoleon needed to focus on, and he could treat all the corps in the centre as a single structure. The reduction in the size of the cavalry corps was rather puzzling to me. I'm uncertain why this occurred in 1815. Perhaps it was to do with a lack of horses or cavalry. I'm not certain. The number of cavalry corps, or the large number of cavalry corps, did allow Napoleon greater flexibility in their deployment, so this could have also been a reason. The other interesting trend was the increased use of light cavalry in the cavalry corps. In the beginning of the Napoleonic War period, the cavalry corps were the heavy cavalry designed to respond to a crisis or to break a weakened enemy line. As time went on, the cavalry corps increased the number of light cavalry formations within them. Once again, this could have been due to a lack of horses, or at least large horses, but the trend began when Napoleon did possess a good supply of horses, so there must have been some other tactical benefit of mixing light cavalry in with heavy cavalry. And so we come to an end of my part 16 of my video series on the French corps system, which was developed during the Napoleonic War. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.